In this episode, I'm going to explore human rights and religious freedom. And there is some genuinely exciting good news for Australia on those fronts. My guest is Martin Iles, Founding Director of the Human Rights Law Alliance, HRLA. Martin studied law at the University of Queensland and worked at a top-tier law firm before taking up a role as the Chief of Staff at the Australian Christian Lobby. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule and joining us, Martin.
Not a problem, David.
Tell me about the Human Rights Law Alliance. It's exciting, as I said.
Yes, well, you mentioned that I worked at the Australian Christian Lobby for a while as Chief of Staff. The Human Rights Law Alliance is something that was started essentially from inside ACL and was established by ACL, so it's a great initiative of theirs. But the idea is to create a body that is able to engage in some of these religious freedom cases that are coming up around Australia. We sort of saw a number of issues. There's a case called Christian Youth Camps and COBOR coming out of Victoria about a Christian campsite and the arrangements they made with a youth group, a homosexual youth group, about whether they wanted to take their booking. There's been other cases like the Catch the Fire Ministries case in Victoria, which was one about some Christian pastors doing some seminars on Islam. I believe one of them was a convert from was previously a Muslim. And some of those cases that came up around the free speech, freedom of association, religious freedom type space, we sort of thought, well, there's going to be some issues going into the future with those kinds of laws. So we're established to engage in some of those cases as they come up, to help people out, give them legal support, but also to be able to do it from a central sort of location where we're able to have a bit of strategy about the way we argue certain things, what kind of legal doctrines we want to put forward, what ones are helpful, what ones are not helpful, that kind of thing. So we take on legal cases and we do a bit of lobbying as well. So I'm able to help ACL in particular with some of the human rights law, 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, things like that, reform to those kinds of laws. Okay.
Now, I'm aware of a similar organisation in America. What are they called again?
Well, there's several. There's the Becket Fund is one. There's the I always forget. I think there's the ACLU. Yeah. And the ACLJ is the good guys, right?
Yeah, the ACLJ.
Right. American Civil Liberties. What's J stand for? I don't know.
Justice?
Probably justice. Yeah, no, it doesn't stand for justice. I don't think so. But anyway, the ACLJ, and there's also one called the Alliance Defending Freedom. That's cheating. The Alliance Defending Freedom is the other one. Now, they're sort of in the States, but they're also in Europe, and they're in Latin America now, and they're in India, and they're all over the place, the United Nations. So there's quite a few bodies in international jurisdictions, but this is new for Australia.
So if you haven't heard of overseas cases where florists and bakers and photographers are being prosecuted aggressively for living out their religious convictions in their business and not having anything against individuals and people, but refusing to participate in the celebration of things which violate their religious conscience, we're seeing people being prosecuted for being Christians and for being consistent in their private life and their public and professional life. So that's really concerning. It's really concerning for me because, and for a lot of Christians, because we're seeing the erosion of freedom. We're seeing people being targeted and attacked simply for having religious convictions and being consistent about it, not simply being a Sunday Christian, not being a hypocrite. So the concern, obviously, is that that's just a matter of time for Australia. And you're saying there's already cases where Christians and Christian organisations are being targeted specifically, if not aggressively, because of their convictions. Are there any examples you can give us?
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, there's the case that made headlines a little while ago, which was that of Archbishop Julian Porteous, who's the Catholic Archbishop of Hobart, and he put out a booklet, a pastoral letter it was, and it was outlining the Catholic Church's teaching on marriage. Anyone who's met the Archbishop knows he's a very gentle and a gracious man, and the book was written in his voice. And there was just the impossibility of being offended by it, it was probably what stood out. And yet there was a transgender Greens activist, a Greens candidate and an activist, Martine Delaney, took the Archbishop to the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Commission. And that complaint was admitted by the Commissioner, and proceedings began. Now, she withdrew the complaint after 8 months or so. But that was largely a strategic thing, because it was very bad optics for the gay lobby and the same-sex marriage movement and the intolerance. And so it was withdrawn, but there was never any decision given about whether or not this could have gone to the tribunal, whether or not this was a valid complaint. I mean, certainly it was admitted by the Commissioner, so was it valid? And we had a lot of people, I had people contact me in the wake of that, for example. They had blogs they wanted to publish, or they had speeches they want to give, or papers they wanted to write on the issue of marriage. Remember, this was in the context of a plebiscite that was imminent at that stage. So people were talking about it, and they said to me, is this safe? Now, we can facilitate legal advice for people like that, but the answer is, we don't know. There's no way to know. When the bar is so low, and when those complaints are being admitted, you've just got to say to them, good luck with it. If you get in trouble with the law, come talk. That's all you can do. So, that's one sort of thing. I mean, there's other cases.
The reality is, with that kind of threat, the answer is no. It's not safe. You're not definitely going to get in trouble. You're not definitely going to be safe. And in the absence of definitely being safe, you're not safe. You're living with a risk. We're living with a risk because we don't have freedom of political expression, even though it's implied in the Constitution. We don't have freedom of religion, even though it's explicitly said the Commonwealth won't interfere. You can't exercise the free expression of your convictions in the public sphere anymore.
Well, there's limits now. That's absolutely true to say. I mean, Australia is a common law system. A lot of that's being changed, a lot of legislation coming in, but essentially, because our basis is common law, there is a principle of common law which says people are free to do everything they like, anything they like, unless it is specifically prohibited by law. And the problem, I suppose, we're seeing in recent years is that there's been a heaping up of anti-discrimination and anti-vilification laws, and some other laws as well, like the buffer zones around abortion clinics and things like that, which do infringe upon traditional freedom. What once in a democracy like Australia would have been considered a good reason not to have these laws. But now, of course, the tables have turned, and those laws are coming in, and the way they're being applied, and that's very, very important. It's not what they actually say. I mean, people look at me and they say, well, this law says you're not allowed to incite hatred. What's wrong with you? Do you want to incite hatred? No, of course not. The issue is how they're being applied, how they're being administered. It's not what the law actually says. It just gives license to subjectivity, and it gives license to these bodies to apply them willy-nilly, and people get into trouble. So there are incursions on freedom. And I guess the reason we exist is to be able to fight back on some of those incursions, or at least test them in the courts. People can accuse us of being lobbyists and accuse us of being extremists. The fact is, every argument we make has to stand up in a court of law. And so we'll go to court, we'll test these things, we'll get good legal counsel on them, and we'll see what happens. Yeah.
So what we're trying to negotiate legally and politically is conflicting claims to human rights. So, for example, homosexual marriage is a claim to a human right that we hear over and over again. They just assert it's a human right, it's a human right, it's a human right. But I'm familiar with a very long ongoing case in the European Court of Human Rights which rejected that claim. They ruled against the claim that homosexual marriage was a human right. Now, the European Court of Human Rights is by no means a religious institution. They're probably one of the most secular bodies in the world. And so, clearly, the claim is not a foregone conclusion. Whereas I think the claim to freedom of religion and freedom of political expression is a well-established foregone conclusion. So we have these competing rights here, and even some assertion of rights where none have previously been imagined. The the difficulty then is how we negotiate whose claim to a human right actually wins when they actually compete with each other.
That is exactly correct. I mean, you're right specifically on the same-sex marriage thing. European Court of Human Rights has said quite a number of times, as recently as last year, yet again, that it isn't a human right. Now, that's the European Court, though. We've got to remember that that's got jurisdiction over Europe. Doesn't have jurisdiction here. But nonetheless, they actually use human rights instruments that are quite a lot like the international ones that Australia's signed up to. And so it's useful in that regard. But also...
It isn't jurisdictionally useful, but I think it's morally useful.
Of course.
What they're claiming is a moral human right. And my point isn't that they've got jurisdiction over us. My point is that, hang on, some people who have absolutely no scriptural paradigm disagree with your moral claim. It's not.
That's right.
It's not a lay down misere. It's an imagination.
That's right, and it again raises the issue of what do we mean by human rights? Because people use that language all the time, but it's a bit like words like equality or discrimination. You know, he says it one way, she says it another way. They mean completely different things, and they're like ships passing in the night. They're not actually agreeing with each other. So when people say it's my human right, I think very often people aren't thinking about what's the basis for that claim. Why is it their human right? What's their moral truth basis that underlies that claim? Because actually, human rights just anchor in whatever someone's belief about the world is. You know, if my belief about the world is that, you know, life is all about self-actualization, it's all about getting the preferences that I want. It's about fulfilling my needs and who I am and getting into my identity and bringing it out and putting it on the table and saying the law should protect this. Well, fine, same-sex marriage is a human right. Because who I am is, they will say, gay. What I desire in the fulfillment of that is marriage to someone of the same sex. Well, that's a human right, you know. So it depends what you mean by human right, whereas there are others who would take a more objective approach and say, well, no, it's not about your preferences. A human right is actually a legal entitlement, and those entitlements need to be measured according to truth. And the truth about family is that a man and a woman have a child, boom, you've got a family. And that's an objective truth basis in which to ground your human right to the protection of family and marriage. So there's very, very different worldview, diametrically opposed worldviews at play in the human rights space. And one of the reasons we exist is because the classical conception of human rights and the human rights conceptions that are grounded in, you know, objective truth claims, like I've just talked about, are just insufficiently defended these days. There's very few people in the human rights law square who are arguing from this kind of perspective anymore, although it was always the accepted perspective until recently.
Okay. So do enough people know about you? Are you ever frustrated by somebody getting themselves into trouble who should have called you but didn't?
We're fairly new, so we got established in May 2016. We built around a couple of legal matters that were already ongoing. I can't expect everybody to know that we exist. But then also, we're not in the space to take over everything. Some people have their own lawyers they want to use. There are other great legal professionals in Australia that have expertise in this area that aren't necessarily affiliated with us. I've got no problem so long as people are getting good legal representation from the start. And the main issue we were seeing was that, you know, a tribunal, an anti-discrimination commission or something will approach somebody with a complaint and they won't know what to do. It's a very intimidating thing for somebody to receive legal complaints or processes in the mail. They freak out. Most people don't know a lawyer. Most people don't know who would be a good lawyer. And some people don't even know that they can use a lawyer. We've had a few situations like that. And so then they start writing letters and they start trying to defend themselves. And the things they say are just very unhelpful. They need really good representation from the start. So what we're trying to get is a situation where people know that there's help at hand immediately. And so that when the letter arrives, they're on the phone and they're talking to somebody who can help them.
So if they don't have a lawyer or good advice that they already know and familiar with, if they don't have anybody, before they respond to anything, before any phone calls or letters, they give you a call. at the Human Rights Law Alliance.
If they don't have anyone else to reach out to, we'll facilitate legal help and good legal help.
And just to be clear, this is all free advice that you're offering Christian ministries and organisations?
Well, we play it by ear, so we're donor funded, so we don't have limitless money, and litigation is and legal matters are very, very expensive to run. But we've got...
They're not going to get a $1,000 bill for the initial phone call?
No. No. When they ring us up, there's no charge. And in fact, we probably won't charge at all. We usually have a system where we just ask for a donation of whatever they can afford, whether it's a widow's mite or $1 million, it's up to them. Just a donation to put something into the process. And it's not policed. That's the most we ask usually. If it's a big organisation with deep pockets, fine, we might bill at a reduced rate, but it's basically pro bono, basically free.
And the really great thing for all the people I know in ministry is that they probably don't know a lawyer, like you said, and it might be that initial response that's given without good legal advice that actually gets them in more trouble unnecessarily.
Absolutely. I mean, they can go and do things that they think are helping the situation, but you need a lawyer's brain looking at it. You really do, because there's all these snares and traps lying about, and people just need to talk to someone who knows. And we have had situations where somebody's tried to make the situation right, and has just made it a lot worse for themselves. Okay.
Awesome. So we'll put the links to the Human Rights Law Alliance underneath this video. If you get approached with any demands of any sort and look like it's in trouble, the Human Rights Law Alliance is not there to settle fence disputes with your neighbour. They're there to help Christians with religious persecution and such freedom cases. If you don't have somebody already, make your initial inquiries with them, and let's make sure we keep Australia nice and free.